This story happened when I was living at home after college, trying to save money while job hunting. During that time, I spent my evenings in my upstairs bedroom, usually swiping through Tinder profiles. That November night, I was in my room when I heard a sound that made me freeze. My bedroom was on the second floor, facing the backyard where our massive oak tree stood. The sound was faint but distinct. Someone or something was moving through the branches. I sat up in bed and looked toward the window, but the curtains were drawn. Even though I probably should have checked, I was too freaked out to actually open them. I told myself I was being stupid. It was probably just the wind or a branch. I waited for a moment, straining to hear more, but everything had gone quiet. But then, I heard another sound, and curiosity got the better of me. I got up and walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. The backyard was dark and isolated, bordered by thick trees that made it feel cut off from the neighboring houses. I didn't see anything unusual at first. Then I noticed some movement in the old oak tree. Its branches swayed oddly, not like they would in the wind. I sat back down on my bed, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but something felt off. Just as I started to relax, I saw something move past the window. It was quick, just a shadow among the tree branches, but enough to catch my attention. My heart raced as I got up and looked again, but whoever or whatever it was had already shifted position. I scanned the yard carefully, but couldn't spot anything in the darkness. After a few more minutes of silence, I told myself I must have imagined it. I went back to bed and tried to fall asleep, but before long, there was a deliberate knock on the window. This time, it was unmistakable. I froze as I saw the silhouette of someone standing on a thick branch right outside. The curtain obscured the details, but it was clearly a man. Then, something happened that made my blood run cold. He called out Rosebud. Not my real name, and not even my nickname Rosie, which my friends called me, but a nickname I'd created just for my Tinder profile. I turned on all the lights in my room, hoping to scare off whoever it was, and watched as the figure carefully maneuvered back through the branches. When I got to the window, they had already disappeared into the darkness below. I stayed awake for hours after that, jumping at every creak of the house settling. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They were skeptical. My father even checked the tree, but found no obvious signs that anyone had climbed it. My mother suggested I was just stressed from job hunting, letting my imagination run wild. But I knew what I'd heard. That voice saying my nickname kept replaying in my mind. We looked around the yard anyway, but there weren't any obvious signs of someone being there, and I couldn't give them a clear description of the person. They suggested I was being paranoid about normal nighttime noises, but agreed to stay alert just in case. That next night was worse. I stayed up late watching TV with my parents in the living room, trying to shake off my unease. It was a little after midnight when I headed up to my room. I was barely through the door when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone climbing the oak tree. I immediately ran to my parents' bedroom and woke them up. My dad followed me back to my room to check what I was hearing. Sure enough, the branches were still creaking. Someone was definitely climbing up. While Dad stayed with me, Mom called the police from their room. The police arrived quickly. their flashlights sweeping across our backyard. They found a man in the tree, but in his panic to escape, he'd gotten himself stuck between two branches. They actually had to call the fire department to help get him down. As they finally managed to escort him to the police car, I felt sick to my stomach. I recognized him immediately. 2 weeks prior to this incident, we had matched on Tinder and met for coffee. The date had been unsettling from the start. Throughout our hour-long conversation, his coffee sat untouched while he watched me drink mine. During our chat, he bragged about his job in cybersecurity, going on about how he could hack into anything. His questions had been odd and increasingly creepy. He kept asking about my living situation, made sexual comments about the clothes I was wearing, and couldn't lift his eyes from my chest for long periods of time. He was also weirdly obsessed with my schedule, wanting to know exactly when I'd be home each day. At the time, I'd written it off as social awkwardness. After I declined a second date, his messages became increasingly erratic. He'd send long paragraphs about how we were meant to be together, followed by angry accusations when I didn't respond. Even after I blocked him, he created at least one new profile trying to match with me. In fact, I had unknowingly matched with one of his fake profiles while swiping on Tinder. I didn't realize it at the time, but after everything happened, I checked my Tinder messages and found one from that match. "I'm outside your window. Let me in so we can be together." What the police found in his car made everything feel even more disturbing. The trunk contained a notebook filled with detailed descriptions of my daily life. There were photographs too, dozens of them. Some showed me getting into my car, others through windows while I was inside coffee shops or stores. The most disturbing discovery was a folder of screenshots from my own laptop's webcam. Intimate moments of me in my bedroom, changing clothes, getting ready for bed. He had somehow hacked my computer, watching me through my own screen for days. During questioning, he admitted everything. His obsession had started after our Tinder date. He told them how he'd followed me home from the coffee shop that day, wanting to know where I lived. He even admitted to accessing my laptop one day when I'd left it briefly unattended at a coffee shop. Back when I was in my late 20s, we used to spend Thanksgiving at my sister-in-law Marie's house. She lived about an hour's drive away. Marie had earned quite a reputation in the family for her constantly changing relationships. My best friend coined the nickname Ho-in-Law one night while we were hanging out. I had a chuckle inside, but told him to knock it off. She is my wife's sister after all. That particular Thanksgiving, our car was in the shop, so Marie offered to pick us up in her red convertible. Her latest boyfriend was supposed to help with dinner prep, but had stopped answering her texts the day before. Typical drama for Marie. The first part of the drive had been quiet and seemingly uneventful. About halfway through, Marie mentioned a vehicle following us and kept checking her mirror. At that point, we all turned around to have a look. It was a black pickup truck that had stayed with us through several turns. Apparently, it had been following us almost since we left our house, but I hadn't noticed until Marie pointed it out. Marie wondered aloud if it might be one of her exes. She dated a guy with a similar truck a few months back. None of us had an answer for why the truck was still there. It wasn't tailgating us, just keeping a steady distance. But something about it felt odd. As we approached Marie's house, the modest homes were situated closer together. The house next door had a rough crowd that had moved in about a year ago, with cars and bikes coming and going at all hours. Marie even mentioned in disbelief that the truck couldn't possibly be following us all the way there, yet it stayed with us through every turn. We passed only 2 other cars on these neighborhood streets, but the truck remained behind us the entire time. Marie's nervous glances at the rearview mirror became more frequent. Eventually, we reached Marie's street, driving slower now as we approached her driveway. The truck was still behind us, maintaining the same distance. Marie considered driving past her house to see if the truck would keep following, but she ended up pulling into the driveway. To our relief, the truck continued down the street and didn't stop. Since we were catching a ride with Marie, we ended up being first to arrive at 10 a.m., giving her time to finish cooking before everyone else showed up. My wife went to help in the kitchen while I brought in the coolers from the garage. More family would be arriving around noon, so we had about 2 hours to get everything ready. Marie spent half the time checking her phone and complaining about her no-show boyfriend while basting the turkey. Other family members started arriving around noon. My parents pulled in first, followed by my wife's and Marie's parents bringing extra chairs. Soon our cousins showed up with their kids. The usual family gossip started immediately. Questions about Marie's missing boyfriend of the week led to eye rolls from her mother and whispered conversations in the kitchen. Marie's house was large, with a wooded front yard, so it was the perfect place for family gatherings. From inside, there wasn't much of a view of the street out front, but you could see it a little if you were near certain windows. Throughout the afternoon, different groups formed as usual. The kids played video games upstairs. Some adults watched football. Others helped in the kitchen. I moved between groups but spent most time in the living room watching the game. At one point, I glanced out the front window and saw the same black pickup driving by, going the opposite direction. It moved slowly, and I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything. Maybe 5 minutes later, I saw the truck again. This time, it came back from the other direction, driving even slower. It stopped briefly just past Marie's driveway and sat there for about 30 seconds before pulling away. This really caught my attention, so I went to find Marie and told her about it. She went to the window, muttering something about crazy exes under her breath. She wasn't too concerned, though, since the truck had left again. I returned to the living room and got distracted talking to people and watching the game. Around 4 p.m., we all gathered to eat. The dining room, which faced the front of the house, was crowded with everyone squeezing in around the table. Dinner lasted about an hour, with people taking seconds and sharing stories. Some of the kids finished early and went back upstairs, while most adults returned to the living room to watch more football. Marie kept checking her phone between serving dessert, still hoping for a text from her missing boyfriend. By this time, the sun had set, and the wooded front yard was completely dark. I was sitting near the front window again when I thought I saw movement outside. At first, it was hard to tell because there weren't any lights out there, but I was sure I saw someone moving behind one of the large trees near the driveway. I kept watching, and a few seconds later, a man ran from the tree to a bush closer to the house. From my angle, I could see him peering through the dining room's front windows, where some family members were still eating dessert. I stood up and asked my wife next to me if she had seen it, but she hadn't noticed anything. Through the window, I could see the man more clearly now, wearing dark clothes. As I started telling my wife about the man, someone began aggressively trying to open the front door of the house. The door was locked, thankfully, but the violent rattling startled everyone in the room. Marie jumped up from the couch, knocking over her wine glass as she rushed to look outside, immediately assuming it was one of her ex-boyfriends. At least 3 family members asked if anyone had gone out, and we all indicated no. Marie hit the exterior floodlights, and my wife, who had moved to the window, saw a heavily tattooed man running away from the house toward a black pickup truck. Several of us immediately checked that all doors and windows were locked, in case he returned. Marie called 911 and told them what was happening. The man ran to his truck, and it seemed like he was about to leave, but then his phone rang. After a brief conversation, he reached into his jacket and pulled out what looked like a handgun. He started walking back toward the house, gun raised. He was shouting something we couldn't hear clearly. We all moved away from the windows. In the distance, we could hear approaching sirens. That's when I noticed the man run back to his black pickup and speed away down the street, past next door, a place we all knew was connected to gang activity. The police managed to block the pickup's escape and catch the man at the end of the street. The truth came out during questioning. The man belonged to a gang that was rivals with Marie's next-door neighbors. He'd been watching her distinctive red convertible regularly parked on the street, outside their house. He'd assumed her car belonged to someone connected to the gang and followed it that day, thinking our Thanksgiving gathering was some kind of gang meeting. He'd brought the gun expecting confrontation with rival gang members, not realizing he was terrorizing an innocent family celebration. The next year at Thanksgiving, we celebrated elsewhere. Marie had already been planning to move, uncomfortable with the increasingly obvious gang activity next door. While we'd initially suspected one of her ex-boyfriends as the stalker, the truth had been much simpler. Her car in the wrong place, at the wrong time, had led to a dangerous case of mistaken identity. This story happened several years ago during Thanksgiving weekend, back when we were hosting Friendsgiving at our rental home when things took a strange turn. The real kicker to the story comes at the end. I lived in a 2-story house with my sharemate, and we were expecting about a dozen friends for the celebration. The house was surrounded by trees, located just outside a small college town. It was peaceful, but also isolated, with no neighbors nearby to see or hear anything if something went wrong. We had prepared most things earlier in the week, cleaning the house and shopping for groceries. Guests were supposed to arrive around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At about 11 a.m., we realized we didn't have enough drinks. My sharemate offered to drive into town to pick up what we needed from a convenience store, while I stayed back to finish getting everything ready. It wasn't far, but the winding rural roads and limited cell service in the area meant she'd likely be gone for at least 30 minutes. After she left, I went to the garage to grab extra folding chairs we'd need for the meal. The garage was detached from the house, connected by a short breezeway. It was cold that morning. Inside the garage, I grabbed the folding chairs and began stacking them. As I worked, I heard the faint sound of the back door opening and closing. At first, I thought my sharemate had forgotten something and come back. I paused, listening, but no other sounds followed. Brushing it off, I carried the chairs through the breezeway and into the kitchen. Once inside, I checked my phone to see if she had texted, but I couldn't get a signal. This wasn't unusual in the house. The service was spotty at best, and I'd learned over time that moving upstairs or standing by certain windows sometimes helped. I made a mental note to try later and went back to prepping the dining area. Suddenly, above me, I could hear slow, steady footsteps moving across the floor. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The creak of the floorboards was unmistakable. Someone was walking around upstairs. My heart started to race as I stood there, unsure of what to do. None of our friends were supposed to arrive for another 2 hours, and even if they had shown up early, they wouldn't have entered the house without knocking or calling out. I grabbed my phone again and sent a quick text to my sharemate, asking if she had come back. The message wouldn't send. I stepped toward the stairs as I listened to the footsteps moving across the floor above me. The footsteps paused for a moment before starting again, this time heading toward the staircase. I was already at the bottom, frozen as each creak above me grew louder. Whoever was up there was getting closer, and I felt trapped, unsure of where to go. Fear took over, and I turned, rushing out through the breezeway and into the garage. I locked the garage's side door behind me and checked the main car door. It wasn't fully closed. I grabbed the release cord hanging from the mechanism and pulled it down, slamming the door shut manually. This time, I climbed onto a stack of bins to try and get a better signal. The message went through, but I didn't get a reply. I called 911 and told the dispatcher everything. The silence was deafening, broken only by faint footsteps on the breezeway. My heart pounded as I realized whoever had been inside the house was now outside the garage. The footsteps stopped at the garage's side door, and the doorknob rattled as they tried to open it. When it didn't budge, I heard them move toward the large car door, testing it next. It stayed closed, but then the footsteps came back to the garage's side door. The doorknob rattled again, followed by a soft knock. They didn't say anything, just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of them throwing their weight against the door, their shoulder hitting it as they tried to force it open. Moments later, I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My sharemate was back. I felt a mix of relief and fear as I waited, unsure of what would happen next, hoping her arrival would scare the intruder away. Her voice rang out from outside, startling whoever was at the garage door. The footsteps quickly retreated, moving away from the garage. I waited a moment before unlocking the garage's side door. I met my sharemate breathless and shaking. She had read my text, so she knew something was wrong. I told her I had already called the police, and we decided to wait for them in her car. We locked the doors behind us and watched the house in silence. The minutes dragged by as we waited. The police arrived after about 10 minutes and searched the house. They found the intruder upstairs, hiding in my bedroom closet. He looked disheveled and unkempt, with dirty clothes and a blank, unsettling expression. I didn't recognize him at all. As they led him out in handcuffs, one of the officers noticed something lace partially hanging out of his jacket pocket. He pulled out a pair of my underwear, a piece I had hung out on the clothesline earlier that day. The officer later explained that during questioning, the man admitted to stealing other items from the property over the past several months. Specifically, he had been targeting my lingerie. I had noticed things disappearing every few weeks, but had dismissed it, thinking the wind or animals were responsible. My sharemate had never had anything taken, which made the realization even more unsettling. Knowing he had escalated from lurking outside to breaking into our home made my skin crawl. Even now, the thought of someone watching us for months is something I still can't shake. This happened back when I was a senior in high school, living with my mom in a suburban cul-de-sac. I usually worked at the local convenience store, but had Thanksgiving Day off. That morning, we discovered we'd forgotten a few essential items for dinner. Since I knew the store layout well from working there, I offered to make a quick run. The convenience store was about 10 minutes from our house. Usually, I dreaded working holidays when we were open, dealing with grumpy customers who'd forgotten something. Being on the other side of the counter felt strange. When I arrived around 10 a.m., the parking lot was nearly empty, except for a couple of other cars. Inside, one of my coworkers was there. She was looking bored behind the counter. The usual morning coffee crowd was missing. One other customer browsed the aisles, probably another person on a holiday emergency run like me. I gathered everything quickly and checked out, making small talk with my coworker about how weird it felt being there on Thanksgiving. The whole trip took maybe 15 minutes. The drive home was simple: one main road and then a turn into our cul-de-sac. Since it was Thanksgiving morning, the streets were unusually empty. Most houses already had cars in their driveways. Families settled in for their celebrations. Our cul-de-sac was particularly quiet that morning. Usually there were kids playing or people walking dogs, but today every house looked still. Most of our neighbors had family over, their driveways full of cars, but our end of the street remained empty and silent. I got home, brought the groceries to my mom, who was already cooking, and spent the rest of the day helping her prepare dinner. The house filled with familiar holiday smells: turkey, stuffing, and pumpkin pie. We weren't expecting guests until evening, so I eventually went to my room to relax and watch some TV. That night, we went to bed late after our small family dinner. I could sleep in the next day since it was a holiday weekend. But for some reason, I woke up much earlier than planned. I checked my phone and saw it was a little after 6:30 in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise, and I was thirsty, so I sat up to get a drink of water. There was a window next to my bed, so I opened the blinds to look outside. When I did, I saw a car parked on the street in front of our house. This was really strange because we rarely had anyone park there, and being at the end of a cul-de-sac, there was no reason for random cars to stop. It was a black muscle car. When I looked closer, I noticed no one was inside. The car seemed out of place in our quiet neighborhood, especially at that hour. Most of our neighbors drove sensible SUVs and minivans. The silence was absolute. No early morning traffic, no dog walkers, no newspaper delivery. I stayed at the window, keeping an eye on it. About a minute later, I saw a man walking from the side of our house. He was wearing a winter hat and a dark jacket, but I couldn't make out his face clearly in the growing dawn light. His movements were deliberate and confident as he walked through part of our front yard and back to the car. He didn't get in the driver's seat. Instead, he opened the trunk and grabbed something from inside. It looked like a small duffel bag, but it was hard to tell because it was still dim outside. The bag seemed heavy from how he carried it. He closed the trunk and started walking again. That's when he turned in my direction and stopped. I realized he could see me because I had a small lamp on in my room. Even though it wasn't very bright, it was enough for someone outside to see me through the open blinds. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Me frozen at my window, him standing motionless in our yard. I quickly closed the blinds and ducked down. I went to get my mom and told her what I had seen. She came back to the window with me, and we both looked out. She spotted the man by the black muscle car parked out front and immediately called the police. While she was on the phone, we heard the car door slam, followed by the engine starting. By the time she finished the call, the car was speeding away down the street. When the police arrived, they found fresh scrape marks around our back door lock. They said it looked like he'd been trying to find a way in before I spotted him, and likely went to the car to get some tools. A few days later, an officer called with disturbing news. The car was identified as a stolen vehicle, which was later used in an attempted kidnapping of a high school girl just 2 towns over. Like he had done with me, he'd been watching her house and learning her routine. But she had her dad there when he tried to break in, and her father managed to overpower him. Later I realized that one of the cars I'd seen parked outside the convenience store that morning was the black Challenger, and the other customer browsing the aisles had likely been him. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up early that morning.